Reviewing the scientific literature to answer your questions about gender diversity, this is Classroom Psychology. And now here's your host, Dr. Cora Sargent. Hello everybody and welcome to Classroom Psychology. I'm your host Cora. Thank you so very much for joining me. It's wonderful to see you. Hop on in here and let's talk a little bit more about gender diversity this week. As we do every time we come together, we take a look at a comment made by a public figure, often, in the style of confident declaration, and then we take it as the question we know it is intended to be, and we take a look to the scientific literature to see if we can't find an answer. This week's question comes from Abigail Schreier, author of Irreversible Damage, The Transgender Craze Seducing Our Daughters. Maybe slightly provocatively titled, I know, but Abigail Schreier, I think, poses this question kind of brilliantly. So here we have Abigail Schreier.
But in the last decade, thanks in large part to social media, there's been another population that claims to have gender dysphoria. This is a population that never before had gender dysphoria in any significant numbers. In fact, before 2007, there was no extant scientific literature on their having gender dysphoria at all. Teenage girls. This is the phenomenon Brown University public health researcher Dr. Lisa Littman called rapid onset gender dysphoria. And it refers to a sudden spike in transgender identification among teen girls with no childhood history of gender dysphoria at all. Not only have the rates of these girls claiming trans identification risen dramatically in the US and all across the West, over 4,400% rise in teen girls presenting for gender treatment at the UK's National Gender Clinic, for instance. But teenage girls are now the leading demographic of those claiming to have gender dysphoria.
Thanks so much to Abigail Schreier for this question. And for sure, it's an interesting question. Both, is there a rise in adolescents assigned female at birth seeking support from the Tavistock Gender Identity Development Service? That's the first question. And I think there is, right? And, behind this question, you might see people say, there's this big inverse of the ratio. What was the case is that most people attending the Gender Identity Development Service were assigned male at birth, and now most people attending are assigned female at birth. What's happening here is the sort of cry. And for sure, that is technically true. The ratio back in 2009 was that there were only 15 adolescents assigned female at birth referred into the service and 24 adolescents assigned male at birth. So you've got to realize that, the ratio was biased towards adolescent, sort of those assigned male at birth, but there weren't many people in the service, right? Very few. 15 versus 24 is tiny per year. That's just minimal, so nothing compared to the population. If we take a look in 2016, for sure that ratio inverts, but the numbers climb very significantly towards 1,071 people assigned female at birth being referred into the service and 426 assigned male at birth. These are adolescents particularly. When we take a look at the children, the ratio is much more a little bit biased towards those assigned male at birth, but actually quite equal. In 2016, there were 138 children assigned female at birth referred into the service and 131 assigned male at birth referred into the service. So a lot more equal when it comes to children and a bit more biased, significantly biased, I think, towards those assigned female at birth when we're talking about adolescents. Now, if you take a look at a graph between 2009 to 2016, you'll see what looks very much like an astronomical rise, an exponential rise in people referred into the service. But actually, if you take a look at a graph from 2010 or 2009 all the way through to today, you'll see that it actually tails off, it levels out, plateaus after 2018. So if you take a look all the way to 2016, for sure, there was this sort of astronomical exponential rise. We had about 1,400 people referred into the Gender Identity Development Service in 2015-16, and then nearly 2,000 people referred in 2016-2017, 2,500, a few more between 2017 and 18, and then it starts to tail off quite heavily. There's only about 2,000, something like 2,600, 2,700, 2018-19. Again, about 2,700, 2019-20, and then it comes down in 2020-21, but that's probably a COVID effect. But what's interesting is that, for sure, it seemed to go through this quite exponential rise between 2000, about 2012 all the way through to 2017, but it then plateaued. And that graph, that describes a sort of, an increase, a dramatic increase in the number of young people coming forward for support. But that's not necessarily it doesn't follow all the way through, right? So we aren't seeing that exponential rise continue into the current day. It's plateaued and tailed off. So we're now seeing, a couple of thousand people referred into the service every year. But I would suggest that that's not beyond the pale, right? If we're considering that 0.5%, maybe a little less of the population are transgender, that's not even including other gender diverse communities like the non-binary communities or gender fluid communities, we should be seeing thousands of people, young people, referred into these services every year. That's not surprising to me. So in response to the premise of Abigail Schreier's question, for sure, she's right. There was an exponential rise in children and young people referred into Gender Identity Development Service in the UK. And, for sure, it looks like that was an exponential rise between sort of 2013, 2017, but it has plateaued off. Now, the next part of her question is about the bias, and she's right. Obviously, there are about double, it's about 2 to 1, double the number of adolescent people assigned female at birth referred into the service in 2016 than they were assigned male at birth. So this is absolutely fascinating to my mind, right? We desperately need to understand why in the world this would be the case, that we'd have so many more trans guys coming forward for transition-related services than for trans girls. Now, the first thing that we can do is to take a look at some of the other, is this a worldwide phenomenon or is this a UK-only phenomenon, right? We've got a few different sources of information we can go to. The first is Handler and colleagues, 2019. They conducted a study from the Kaiser Permanente, Gender Development Service in Northern California, the KPNC, between 2015 and 2018. They looked at 417 patients referred into the clinic. And again, we see the mean age at time of referral was 15 years, and 73% of those referred in were assigned female at birth. There were 303 people assigned female at birth referred into the service, and 114 of those assigned male at birth. The vast majority of those were trans guys who were, assigned female at birth. Some of them were non-binary, 56 were non-binary, but 257 of the 303 referred in were trans guys. We've also got Arnoldson's work that was just conducted last year. That's from the Amsterdam Center of Expertise in Gender Dysphoria. That's 1,487 adolescents referred in. And they can see 2 spikes in the data, one pre-puberty and one sort of mid or post-puberty. With those in the sort of mid or post-puberty, there is this sort of big bias towards those assigned female at birth. So we have this, again, roughly double in the adolescent population, those referred in during adolescence between the ages of 14 and 18. We see about double those referred in as were assigned female at birth compared to those assigned male at birth. So again, Abigail Schreier, fascinating point. There does seem to be this big rise, or at least a bias in those seeking treatment towards those assigned female at birth. And then we have Vanderloos and colleagues in 2013 from the Center of Disease on Gender Dysphoria in the Amsterdam UMC. This is actually the same Amsterdam clinic, but they captured more of the children that were referred in. So in this study, just conducted this year, 1,766 children and adolescents, and we can see that the number of people referred in during adolescence, there's about 1.6 times the number of people assigned female at birth as those assigned male at birth. So again, there is this bias towards people assigned female at birth, which is fascinating, and something that definitely needs understanding. Now, the first thing that we can do to understand this is say, right, so this is reflected in Amsterdam, reflected in the States, in California, reflected in the UK. Is it reflected in the wider population or just in those referred in? And what's interesting is that there's a really big nationally representative sample from Turpin et al. In the US, 2022. So they conducted a survey with nearly 200,000 adolescents, of which around 2,000 were identified as transgender and gender diverse. And they found that the ratio was biased towards people assigned male at birth. In 2017, they found that the ratio was about 1.5 times the number of people assigned male at birth compared to those assigned female at birth. And in 2019, it was a ratio of about 1.2 times those assigned male at birth compared to those assigned female at birth. So in the broader, while in Amsterdam clinics, in California clinics, and in the UK clinic, we see this big rise in young, adolescent people assigned female at birth seeking transition-related services, we don't see it reflected in the broader population, at least in the US. It's a pretty good sample, this one from Turpin. I couldn't find one similar in the UK, but this is the best evidence we have that it's probably not reflected in the broader population, only in those seeking treatment. So our question together needs to be why? Why is this happening? Why have we got this big rise in or this big bias towards people assigned female at birth heading into gender identity clinics worldwide, seemingly, or at least across the Western world? So let's start by taking a look at Abigail Schreier's explanation for this. So she says essentially that that this big rise in people assigned female at birth might be evidence of rapid onset gender dysphoria. Now, she's quoting there from Lisa Littman, who she also references. Now, this is possibly one of the most amazing studies I've come across. Like, this whole phenomenon of rapid onset gender dysphoria as a title is maybe one of the wildest things I've come across in this field of research. I think it actually is the wildest. Let me talk to you about what happened. So in a few years ago, Lisa Littman, who was assistant professor at Brown University, essentially surveyed 256 parents. And she found that these parents all shared an experience that their children, or their adolescent children, started to experience gender dysphoria at or shortly after adolescence without a prior history of gender dysphoria. And what she was doing was raising an alarm that it's possible that there's a group of young people who aren't transgender at all, but who are the sort of recipients of a social contagion phenomenon, right? That they've been kind of infected by a change in the prevailing winds of acceptance towards the transgender community. Now, she decided to term this rapid onset gender dysphoria. Now, that decision to create a kind of pseudo-diagnostic label was a massive decision. I don't think anybody could have anticipated the impact that that would have. This study has been read a cool 500,000 times. Now, my work that I supervise, that we publish, we're lucky if it gets read like 100 times. Hundreds of thousands of times this study has been read. Now, that is bananas to me. Now, it was followed up by another study from Diaz and Bailey a little bit later, citing 1,655 cases of the same phenomenon worldwide. Now, you might think, wow, this is fascinating, right? So we've got these adolescent girls is a terrible phrase, but this is the phrase that people use to describe it. These adolescent girls who are caught up in this phenomenon, they see how cool it is to be transgender on social media. They have all these friends and all these trans friends and social support, and they therefore get swept up in this phenomenon. So maybe we need to be really careful and have a much more cautious approach to treatment when it comes to these adolescent girls seeking support. Now, what happened, I don't think I've ever seen anything like this in this field, right? Lisa Littman's study had to be withdrawn and republished, and the editor apologized, saying, We apologize to the trans and gender variant community for the previous review and publication. They said the study, including its goals, methodology, and conclusions, were not adequately framed in the published version, and that needed to be corrected. Now, this is amazing. Heber noted in this apology that the hypothesized condition of ROGD had not yet been clinically validated. Not wrong. And if you look at the details of Lisa Lippman's work, now I have a great deal of time for Diaz and Bailey, right, who followed up Lisa's work. Diaz and Bailey were really very transparent about the work that was being done. Yeah, they were transparent about the methodology, and they were transparent about the deep potential for bias that comes out of the methodology. Lisa Lippman's work is also very biased, but it didn't have the same kind of open, transparent, reflection upon that bias as Diaz and Bailey do. Now, Lippman's study, you're going to be blown away by this, I'm sure, because I was reading through the study in detail, and I was just like, this is amazing. So Lisa Lippman drew the surveyed parents from Fourth Wave Now. Now, Fourth Wave Now was created in 2015, and taken. You can see from the site, from the sort of digitally archived screenshots from 2015 and 2016, states that it is a, in inverted commas, safe place for gender skeptical parents and their allies. It offered support for parents and expressed concern about the rush to diagnose young people as transgender and the rush to proceed to medical treatment for them. They also gathered people from Transgender Trend, a youth trans critical group, essentially, and youth trans critical professionals and parents of transgender children, which is a private Facebook group. They're all deeply critical of gender and of the transgender community. And of course, the stories that these parents were telling were not their own. Right? None of these parents had, as far as we could know from Lisa Lippman's work, none of the parents had any evidence that their children hadn't been experiencing gender dysphoria before adolescence. They just learned about their gender dysphoria in adolescence, and maybe these young people experienced gender dysphoria for the first time in adolescence. That's always possible too. Doesn't mean that their experience is any less valid. But for sure, all we can say here from these surveys is that parents experienced their children having gender dysphoria for the first time in adolescence and not beforehand. It doesn't mean that they didn't experience it beforehand. But Lisa Lippman's study, going on to describe a phenomenon of these young people, right? This isn't a phenomenon of parental perception. This is a phenomenon she described of young people, rapid onset gender dysphoria. They experienced rapid onset gender dysphoria with no prior history. There's just nothing in this work that can substantiate that claim. Now, Diaz and Bailey, I have way more time for Diaz and Bailey's work. I think it's really good that they are so open about their work. I've got to say that I'm pretty amazed that the work was published. I mean, I know why it was published, because it, while it has some deep and I think fatal methodological flaws, the work cannot stand at all on its own. I would say that those methodological flaws make the results extremely difficult to interpret. And I was sort of dismayed that the authors are still using the term rapid onset gender dysphoria in the work, as though it's a sort of potentially real thing, without any validation from any source that I can find in the published sphere. And they, I think the reason they got published, though, is because they're very open about all of these things, right? They're very open about the fact that the methodology is very biased, and that they sort of speak to it directly in the work. So I get it. But it does continue to kind of lend credence to rapid onset gender dysphoria without actually being able to do so. So basically what they did, they take a look, again, no information on patient outcomes. They take a look at gathering a worldwide sample of parents in much the same way. They gathered them from parents of ROGDkids.com, right? So it's not at all surprising that they found gender critical parents, because they went to parents of ROGDkids.com. Again, ROGD just finding its way into the public zeitgeist in a way that worries me deeply. Now, the other source of bias here is from the advert itself. I'm going to try not to laugh as I read this. It's so bananas. So this is the advert, right? The authors state in the advert, bearing in mind that when they conducted this work, it wasn't designed to be published research. They're very open about this. Like, the methods weren't, none of this was designed to be published research. It just became something that they wanted to publish later. So, you've got to bear in mind that none of these methods that they're using here, including the advert, none of it went through a university ethics committee or anything like that, which is amazing. The editor of the journal decided that they thought that the work appreciated its own limitations to the extent that it could be published. But yeah, none of this went through an ethics committee or anything like that. Here's the advert, right? They say, rapid onset gender dysphoria is a new phenomenon that is only now beginning to be recognized. I can't. And the so-called gender clinics are not forthcoming with their information about demographics or mental health issues of clients who seek out their services, nor do they publish information on patient outcomes. The task is left up to us, the parents, to seek out this information on our own. Please help us gain a better understanding of this emotionally devastating and physically traumatizing, yet increasingly common phenomenon. So, right, participants were invited to participate if their young person, in inverted commas, suddenly, seemingly out of the blue, decided they identified as the opposite gender or some other gender, in inverted commas. Amazing, right? So clearly, the sample is deeply, deeply, deeply biased. And for sure, I think there is something really interesting here happening. Bearing in mind this is a worldwide, they've got people worldwide looking at this thing through parentsofrgdbkids.com. For sure, there is a chance that there is something of interest here. Parents who's, in a critical sphere, concerned about their child, who don't know about their gender dysphoria until they get to adolescence, or whose children might experience gender dysphoria for the first time in adolescence and are concerned about those experiences, wondering whether their child is really trans or not. And for sure, I'm sure that experience is extremely difficult for parents, I don't doubt. But I'm deeply worried about these kind of approaches where people are reinforcing in the mind of parents or the mind of the general public the idea that rapid onset gender dysphoria is some kind of validated phenomenon. It very, very much is not. Now, not only is it not validated, but we can take a look at the work of Professor Greta Bauer, whose work was designed to test the predictions made by rapid onset gender dysphoria in the clinical data. So Professor Greta Bauer took the clinical data from 173 adolescents from the 10 different Canadian clinics, gender identity development clinics, essentially, all under the age of 16. And they took the distinction between people who had very recent gender knowledge, either within 1 or 2 years of referral to the clinic. That is, so they first realized they were transgender or they first experienced gender dysphoria within 1 to 2 years before accessing the clinic. So Greta defined it as within 1 year of accessing the clinic, but then did a sort of sensitivity analysis and checked 2 years to make sure that there wasn't some dramatically different result, and compared them to people with less recent gender knowledge, those who experienced gender dysphoria for the first time in earlier childhood. Now, controlling for age and sex assigned at birth, they found that recent gender knowledge, that is, experiencing gender dysphoria for the first time within the last year, was not significantly associated with depressive symptoms, psychological distress, past diagnosis with mental health issues or neurodevelopmental disorders, gender dysphoria symptoms, self-harm, past year suicide attempts, having gender supportive online friends, general support from online friends or transgender friends, or general support from parents. Essentially, recent gender knowledge was either not statistically significantly related to any of these outcomes, or they were in the opposite direction to what would be hypothesized by rapid onset gender dysphoria. Something I found really interesting was that recent gender knowledge was associated with lower scores on anxiety, severity, and impairment. Quite possibly because anxiety increases the longer you experience gender dysphoria would be the kind of potential explanation there. So people who experience themselves to have gender dysphoria for the first time in adolescence, it seems that they do not have a sort of dramatically different experience in any of the kind of in parental support or support from online friends or transgender friends or gender supportive online friends or gender support from parents. It doesn't seem that, at least from this data, that gender dysphoria, like the rapid onset gender dysphoria, is a thing, right? It doesn't seem that it is making any predictions that hold out in the clinical data. Now, for sure, we have to bear in mind that this data isn't perfect, right? There's only 173 people in the population, and there's only something in the late 20s, 27 people, I think, who experienced gender dysphoria within the last year. Although, Greta Bauer did do a sensitivity analysis, so she extended that to 2 years, and still didn't find any difference. But it is interesting, Lisa Littman published a commentary on Bauer's paper, which is amazing, as Littman continues to refer to rapid onset gender dysphoria as if it's some kind of validated phenomenon. And she accuses Bauer, this is what's amazing, of using a novel definition. Now, a novel definition, bearing in mind that rapid onset gender dysphoria is itself a novel definition as created in her study out of no clinical data, I don't understand why Bauer's operationalization here is considered somehow less valid. To me, the operationalization of recent gender knowledge seems completely sound. Recent gender knowledge is in within the last year, and with the sensitivity analysis extending it to 2 years, I think it's a reasonable sort of first effort to try and test the predictions of rapid onset gender dysphoria. So I think honestly, we can come to the conclusion here that rapid onset gender dysphoria as a phenomenon is not evidenced in the direct evidence, and just is not supported by the direct clinical evidence. So it seems that if we can put rapid onset gender dysphoria to bed as an explanation for the time being, it's not supported by the clinical data here. If that's the case, then why do we see this huge rise in young people assigned female at birth attending these gender clinics for the first time in adolescence? Actually, what I think might be happening here, the strongest kind of explanation that I can come across, is an explanation that says we are looking at that completely wrong. Pachansky and Brandstrom in 2019 conducted this beautiful study. They basically looked at the size of the global closet, which is a beautiful phrase, by the way. They basically used a large sample of sexual minorities, not gender minorities, just sexual minorities. They collected data across 28 countries, and they managed to gain an objective index of structural stigma across 197 countries. So they basically grabbed data about sexual minority experiences and discriminatory national laws and policies affecting sexual minorities. And they estimated that the majority, about 83% of sexual minorities around the world, conceal their sexual orientation from all or most people. And importantly, country-level structural stigma predicted the size of each country's closeted sexual minority population. They said essentially that if we can eliminate structural stigma, we can reduce the number of people who are hiding. But their evidence suggests that in countries with stronger societal stigma, more people hide. They stay in the closet. They don't tell anyone about their identity. Now, this is fascinating to me because if we take this information, we take this idea and we apply it to gender, we find that actually we have a quite strong cis heteronormative context, right, in the Western world. And we can see right now the sort of the legislative context in the US, where transgender people are having their rights literally removed, particularly access to healthcare for children and young people. We can see in the UK government trying to use Article 35 to prevent transgender people from getting an easier time accessing a gender recognition certificate in Scotland. And we can see time. We had Section 28 30 seconds ago, and we're about to have a new schools guidance published by the UK government, which is almost certainly going to be quite conservative in nature. And we have poor access to healthcare, and we have no ban on conversion therapy for the trans community right now. So, in the UK, we have a context which is quite hostile. And that's before you start talking about the potential for the UK government talking about amending the Equality Act to make it clearer that single-sex provisions mean sex assigned at birth, which would be disastrous for the transgender population. A good example of removing the rights of the trans populations. All it would do is prevent trans populations from, for example, using hospital wards with the gender with which they identify, or using bathrooms and toilets and changing rooms with the gender with which they identify. Can you imagine all these kind of yoked trans dudes in the women's changing rooms, because that's where they're going to be forced to go if that happens? You imagine all these trans girls sitting in the men's toilets because that's where they're going to be forced to go. I can't imagine that's going to make anybody feel safer. And yet that seems to be the direction of travel. So, this is the situation that we have, quite a prejudicial context. And the prejudice sits deeply with trans women, right? When we're talking about excluding people from single-sex spaces, it's constantly trans women that they want to exclude, and trans guys are just kind of ignored. In fact, the consequences of excluding trans women from women's spaces is that trans men will be excluded from men's spaces and wind up in women's spaces. These freaking yoked trans dudes in women's spaces, which cannot be what people are hoping will come from this, right? They're just ignored as a population. Instead, the trans women are, the victims of the sort of, I don't like the word victim. Trans women are the targets of this prejudice. Now, this is where things get really interesting. Now, I when I was in the process of transition, I met a literal secret society of trans women who were men in the world in disguise for most of their lives. They built lives, they had families and careers, and they once a month had made this deal with themselves that they would be women in the world. Just once a month at this secret society, they would be themselves. And it was heartbreaking to be in that secret society of people who were hiding in the world. And this is what happens, I think, in a world that is very prejudicial towards transgender women in particular. People hide. They don't come out. They remain secret. They don't tell anyone. And we know, last week we talked about the retrospective studies talking about transgender folk who don't tell anyone until they're in their 20s, who go with untreated gender dysphoria, who then, finally come out when they're in their 20s or 30s and start transition then, even though no doubt they would have liked to a lot sooner had the world been more accepting. Now, when I came home from that secret society and had a chat with Kaz afterwards, her reaction was abundant, unmovable understanding, as it has always been. And between us, we made a decision, that we wouldn't craft my life into a prison for my authentic self, right? And I can only do that because of the privilege of support that I have in my environment. My university, Sarah, my longtime friend and mentor, she was ultimately hugely supportive, always supportive. The university where I was training to be an EP when I came out, super supportive. The schools that I worked in, the people I worked with, very supportive. And in part, it's also because of the unearned privilege of the fact that I don't need to tell anyone I'm trans necessarily, and people don't always know by looking at me. And, if I work on my voice for a while, then maybe they don't even know it to hear me. But for lots of people out there, they're not in such welcoming, not in such understanding, accepting environments, and instead they have to remain hidden. They have to stay secret in order to stay safe. So maybe we're looking at this all wrong. And instead of seeing this data as an overrepresentation of adolescent people assigned female at birth seeking medical transition-related services, what we should be seeing is that this is actually a reasonable rise, right? The plateau that we're seeing in the last bunch of years in the Gender Identity Development Service referral stats, that plateau identifies that actually what we're seeing is just rising acceptance and a group of people who are coming forward as they, would, because people know when they're relatively young and they come out and search for support. That's kind of what we hope that people would do. And instead of seeing this as an overrepresentation of people assigned female at birth, what we should see this is an underrepresentation of people assigned male at birth. From this year, Vanderloos and colleagues, they wrote this. An explanation that has not been mentioned is that in most Western cultures, it is more widely accepted for people assigned female at birth to come out as trans men than it is for people assigned male at birth longing for a more feminine appearance. The transgender prejudice is so located on transgender women that for adolescents, people who are assigned male at birth, they find it harder to come out, they find it harder to seek support because the world is just, they fear what the world will do. So they stay secret, they stay safe. Anonymity becomes their first line of defense, as it does for so many of us. Thanks so very much for joining me. It's wonderful to see you. Hopefully we came to a reasonable conclusion on this interesting question by Abigail Schreier. Wonderful as it was, and hopefully we've reached what I think is a reasonable conclusion. For sure, we don't know what is going on here. We have only sort of reasonable explanations, but given the work of Greta Bauer, given the sort of theory of van der Loos and colleagues in 2023, I think this is a reasonable conclusion that there's an underrepresentation here of people assigned male at birth, trans girls. They're staying secret and staying safe. Thanks so very much for joining me. This has been Classroom Psychology. You know what? Together, let's see if we can't create a society where everyone can find a place to belong. I look forward to seeing you, as always, in the next one.